Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, the CDP on Deforestation and Supply Chains, Why You Need to Act. My name is Victoria Knowles and I look after the Strategy, Engagement and Supply Chain group here at 2 Degrees. I'm delighted to welcome the presenters today, Paul Simpson, CEO at the CDP, Piet Klopp, Senior Advisor of Responsible Investment at PGGM, Russell Cooper, Brand Integrity and Sustainability Research Manager at Sainsbury's. After the presentations, we'll have just a few minutes at the end where the presenters will answer your questions. Before we start, I'd just like to remind you all that you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Just type in your question and press send, and we'll wait until the end to answer as many as we can. Otherwise, if you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, use the chat box on the right-hand side and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So without further delay, I'd like to pass over to Paul, who will begin the presentation.
To talk about our new report on deforestation in supply chains, and this was actually launched in Australia yesterday. So I'm going to talk about that report in a minute. For those of you who don't know CDP, I'll just briefly explain who we are and why we're working on deforestation. So we're an international NGO working to transform the way the world does business to prevent dangerous climate change and protect our natural resources such as forests. And this year, over 5,000 companies have disclosed through CDP on climate change, water and forests, and I'll talk more about how many of those are on forests in a minute. We started working on climate change solely in the year 2000. However, we always knew that we couldn't ultimately tackle climate change without addressing deforestation. As probably you all know, forests are critical for keeping the global average temperature rise below 2 degrees. They're also critical for rainfall patterns, and we're seeing some impacts potentially of deforestation in Sao Paulo right now. And protecting forests actually provides one of the cheapest and most effective ways of keeping carbon out of the atmosphere and therefore mitigating climate change. So our forest program was pioneered by an Oxford-based NGO called the Global Canopy Program. It was based on our work with investors and companies on climate change, and the Global Canopy Program said to us, look, you're working on climate change, can we do something on deforestation? So they pioneered our forest program, and then last year we formally adopted it. So we now have 6 years of corporate data on the key agricultural commodities which are driving deforestation, and those are timber products, palm oil, cattle products, soy, and biofuels. And these commodities feature in the supply chains of many companies, ending up in food, fuel, and many other everyday products. Some are very clear, some are somewhat hidden. And as demand for these commodities grows, we expect global agricultural cropland to expand by 42% by 2050, putting enormous pressure on forests. And we clearly can't meet this demand without either increasing business and environment risk or innovating and changing the way we behave. So deforestation rates are sadly still increasing. Brazil has made some progress in slowing those quite significantly in the last few years, although they're somewhat up again now. But we're also seeing rates in Southeast Asia increase quite dramatically, and it is understood that in 2014 the rate in Indonesia is thought to have surpassed that in Brazil, which was historically the country with the highest rates. Thankfully, against this challenge, we've seen significant corporate commitments to tackle deforestation over the last couple of years. So the message that deforestation has to be addressed is increasingly understood and adopted by governments and companies, and most recently at the UN summit in New York in September, we saw a strong pledge by governments and multinational companies to eliminate deforestation from the production of agricultural commodities by 2020. And that's building on the work that we've seen from the Consumer Goods Forum and the Tropical Forest Alliance. So we see now an unprecedented number of companies have set strong deforestation targets, Notably, Wilmar International, one of the largest palm oil producers in the world, has committed to zero deforestation by 2020, and that's expected to save more than 1.5 gigatons of CO2, which is roughly equivalent to the combined carbon emissions of Central and South America from energy consumption. So we're going to move to the report, and the focus of this report is really looking at companies are making these commitments. How are they then acting on them? What's the journey companies have to go through from making a commitment to becoming zero net deforestation in their supply chain? And the report really highlights where companies are on that journey. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So the report that we released yesterday is available on our website and has some great infographics, as you can see here in the middle of the slide. This is all on our website, available for free. And the report draws on findings from responses to CDP's information requests from 152 large multinational companies around the world. And really the report dives into what do these responses from companies tell us. Now, the CDP system is really about stimulating a dialogue at the heart of capital markets that's between investors and companies. And we see increasing investor demand for forest risk information. Just in the last year, we've seen a 30% increase in the number of investors asking companies to measure and report on their management of risks associated with deforestation. We now have some 240 investors with $15 trillion of assets asking companies for this information. You'll see on the slide a quote from Abigail Heron of Enviva Investors. Abigail had hoped to join us to present today. We're delighted. We're going to hear from Pete Klopp of PGGM shortly. But Abigail's quote really shows that investors are becoming more interested in this area. They do want information from the companies they invest in, and we're increasingly seeing more investor action. Last year we saw the NBIM, the Government Pension Fund of Norway, take some significant action. This year, Storebrand, one of Norway's largest life insurance and pensions companies, has reported that it's divested holdings in 11 palm oil companies because they failed to meet its sustainability criteria. So some investors are really already taking significant action with the companies, but a growing group are asking for information so they can understand what they should do. Now, if we look at the results from the companies, we can see that this investor interest is really justified because almost 3/4 of these 152 companies recognize at least one risk to their business from sourcing commodities linked to deforestation. Now, these risks come from a number of sources, but one very significant source is that companies see if they are seen to be sourcing unsustainable commodities that are driving deforestation, there is a significant risk to their reputation. That's particularly from some of the high-profile NGO campaigns that we've seen over the last few years, and these are seen by companies to really have a potential to damage their brand and reduce market share. Most recently, we've seen quite a striking campaign by Greenpeace on the palm oil in some products, including those of P&G. So this really shows that companies must get a grip on where they're sourcing their commodities and be able to communicate that well to avoid this reputational risk. There are also many companies saying that if they're not sourcing sustainable commodities, then they have a risk to their whole supply chain and to the continuous sourcing of good quality available commodities. The report really builds on the commitments that I talked about earlier and then portrays a journey that companies have to take from making the commitments through to real leadership on deforestation that will ultimately result in them driving no deforestation. Obviously, these commitments are really great to see. However, they're really only meaningful if companies can translate those into action. And in the report, it shows a 5-step process from the commitments through to a risk assessment process, then setting strong targets on deforestation and implementing actions to deliver those targets. And all of these add up to real leadership. And in the report, you can see examples of best practice along every part of this journey. And we do this particularly so that companies can learn from others and we can all act together to protect our forests. As at CDP, we analyse the responses from the companies and do rank them on the basis of who do we think is a leader. Now, clearly acting on deforestation in supply chains is a very fast evolving area, and the hallmarks of leadership are something that is continuously advancing. And clearly for each company, depending on their sector, their geography and their supply chain, will depend exactly what leadership really looks like. But at CDP, we're clear that there are a number of elements of strong leadership on climate change. You can see those listed here on this slide, but just to pick on a few, as well as setting commitments across all of the forest risk commodities that may be in a company's supply chain, we do need to see companies set strong targets, both for the long term, whether that's 2020 and possibly beyond, but also interim targets to make sure progress is really being made. And we need companies to really work with their suppliers to build capacity in those suppliers and improve their suppliers' behaviour. So a lot of the success of a strategy on deforestation involves collaboration all the way through the supply chain, not just the tier 1 suppliers, but possibly tier 2 and tier 3, right down to the production of these commodities. And finally, real leading companies should be engaging and communicating with customers so that customers can understand how they can differentiate their purchasing decisions and which products to choose that really are completely sustainable. So in the report, we highlight the leading companies, and here you can see on the chart that per sector, these are the leading companies per sector here: Cargill, J. Sainsbury's, and we'll hear from Russell in a moment, Sodexo, SCA, Dai Nippon Printing, UPM, Reed Elsevier, Nestle, Unilever, a company very much flagged up as a leader by many in this area, Marks and Spencer's, LVMH, and British Airways. All of these companies are taking significant actions and really can be held up and celebrated for their leadership on tackling this issue to date. That doesn't mean they're completely sustainable, but it does mean they should be celebrated as taking significant action. So we see a lot of encouraging momentum on this area. When analysing the actions companies are taking, we also see some inconsistencies across those actions. Firstly, we see a strong focus on palm oil and timber from companies. That's somewhat expected. Timber is obviously a very tangible product, directly connected and associated by consumers with trees and forests. Palm oil, there's been significant NGO campaigns to raise the issue of palm oil, and that's very related to deforestation in Indonesia. But we're not seeing so much focus on soy and cattle products. There may be reasons for that. Perhaps companies are driven a bit by NGO campaigns. Some of these soy and cattle issues may be harder to tackle, but we need to see a greater focus on the soy and cattle issues in the coming years if we're going to avoid deforestation. Secondly, we see that companies throughout the supply chain are taking different actions, and what we see actually, as you might expect perhaps, that producers and processors really are taking significant action because they're really dealing with this on the ground. Traders are increasingly engaging with this issue. Some retailers and manufacturers are, but across the board, many retailers and manufacturers are yet to fully understand this issue and develop a strategy in their business. So that's the kind of general places for improvement that we would expect companies to be focusing on over the next year or two. Finally, of course, addressing risk and reducing risk from deforestation provides companies with enormous business opportunities. I often think they're two sides of the same coin. If you can manage risk, you can turn it into an opportunity. And we are seeing the majority of companies, nearly 90% of companies, recognize opportunities associated with sustainable sourcing. I talked already about reputation risk. Companies are seeing increased brand value, leading to growing market share, but also in securing the best suppliers and a sustainable source of supply, both sustainable from an environmental sense, but also from a business sense, because it's those unsustainable suppliers that may get hit by regulation that may cause disruption in companies' supply chain. So what we see is that majority of respondents seeing this opportunity, and those companies that have been tackling this issue for a number of years, they really are realizing more opportunities. So the companies who've been reporting through CDP for 3, 4, 5, 6 years are really realizing more opportunities, demonstrating that if you take serious action on this issue, you will realize those opportunities. So to conclude, the report has some great examples in it. It's available on our website along with the infographic. We have seen such positive progress on tackling deforestation at the commitment level in the last couple of years, and we should celebrate that. We do have some strong leadership from a number of companies, but there are many that really have just started on their journey to zero deforestation. And if we're going to achieve that by 2020, you could say just some 5 years away, we're going to need to see action accelerators. And I leave you with a slide which has the words of Freddie Wolf from Hermes Investment Management. This is a UK-based pension fund that was one of the first investors to really focus on and highlight this as being a very serious risk. So with that, Victoria, I hand back to you.
Great, thank you, Paul. I think next we're going to hear from Pete.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Very good. Yes, my name is Piet Klop. I'm working with PGGM Investments, and the slide that was just shown with a quote from Freddie is spot on. I think it also applies to PGGM. What I think is important to realize is that PGGM is trying to be a responsible asset manager, and yet at the same time we are an index investor. So we own a little bit of everything, also in the equity space, and that has, a particular bearing on our interest in these things. It makes us keen on seeing the market evolve rather than any individual company, and it makes us also very keen on the sort of work that CDP does in coming up with data that are not just relevant, but also comparable and complete. So these three things makes this very important to us. We need data across a particular sector that are indeed relevant, that we can compare, that we can then tilt our index investments to, so away from the high risk towards the low risk companies, and that are indeed then complete. Relevance is something that we would like to tie to this notion of value at risk. And I think Paul just described it quite well. It's risk in many ways. It could be a strategic risk. It could be related to a license to operate or a license to grow. It could also be a reputational risk. It could be an operational risk. And we are keen to interpret the stuff that we get from different sources, NGOs, data providers, but also CDP, in those terms, because that's the one thing that investors understand. Risk is the currency of their trade, or at least institutional investors. So value at risk is, to us, the name of the game. We should all strive towards an increasingly accurate capture of that notion. Now, there's a lot of initiatives that we believe add value to this, and CDP definitely is one of them. We are keen supporters of CDP and all the work it's doing across different themes, not just deforestation, but also water and carbon, obviously, in making data, making companies comparable. They use, or there's a couple of tools these days around that we believe are also helpful in this regard. The Zoological Society of London has just launched its tool. It's peculiar to the palm oil sector, which is the one that I'm most familiar with. and it looks at essentially the quality of disclosure. That's not the whole story, obviously. We would much rather see that risk itself being captured, but it is a good proxy. To us, quality of disclosure equals quality of management. And even that doesn't tell the whole story about what value is at risk. It is a pretty good approximation of it. And we believe that, it's no use waiting for the perfect data. We just got to get going and hopefully kick into gear that virtuous cycle, with better disclosure, more transparency, and indeed the ability and the willingness of investors like PGGM to act on that information and to move out of high-risk companies towards the low-risk ones. Now, we believe that there's a parallel, perhaps, between some sectors, paper, pulp, but also palm oil for sure, and the fossil fuel sector. In fossil fuels, you have proven reserves and unproven reserves. And a case that I always refer to is what happened to Shell back in, I believe, 2004 or so, when they had to move some reserves from the proven to the unproven column. This is the way we look at some of these companies too. They may have a land bank, they may have a claim on a certain amount of land that is less than secure. It could be contested for all sorts of reasons, either because of competing claims by perhaps competitors, but also, environmental purposes of that land, community claims, indigenous claims. So it's from that angle that we believe we can make this notion of value at risk perhaps more tangible. We value those companies because of their operations and because of their growth prospects. If some of those prospects are less than secure because of those competing claims, because of those contested land claims, then we may have to devalue those companies. And that is exactly the sort of thing that we rather anticipate than wait for the market to do it for us. So we like value at risk as a notion that holds this whole thing together. But we do realize that not all values can immediately be monetized. And we also realize that risk is more than just operational risk. In fact, we stress the more long-term risk, because that's another thing about institutional investment. An index investment, perhaps, there's all sorts of criticism you can throw at it. But the good thing is that we at least are in there for the long haul. So we're broadly exposed to the market, and we are long exposed to these risks. And we're not going to walk away from it. We can't. So it's going to hit us one way or the other. And again, that ties us back to the work that CDP is doing. We hope that they can draw in many more companies into this kind of disclosure. Because, it's the market that matters to us, not just any individual company, the market. So market disclosure, market-wide disclosure is what we value in these efforts. And that holds true for this particular report and this particular line of work that the CDP does too. So on that note, kudos to CDP. This is exactly what responsible index investors need. And just to finish off with that thing, index investment is going to grow. We may not like it. We would much rather pick and choose ourselves. But the asset management industry is under pressure to lower its costs. And there's one sure way to do that, and that's to invest through indices. And the thing that we're trying to pull off here is to be a responsible index investor, and we need CDP for that. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Pete. That's great. I'll pass over to Russell now at Sainsbury's.
So hello, everybody. I'm Russell Cooper from Sainsbury's Supermarket, and I sit within what we call our own brand division, which looks after the own brand products that we sell. And clearly, I am charged with trying to ensure that the ingredients, the products that we sell, come from sustainable sources. So for those that are not, I thought I'd give some context to Sainsbury's. with some slides. So let me just move over to the next slide. So for those that aren't aware of Sainsbury's, we are a UK retailer. We have over 1,000 stores in the UK with 24 million customers a week, and we source roughly 12,000 products for our own brand lines from over 700 suppliers, and at the very minimum this comes from over 17,000 farms. So just wanted to highlight the scale of some of the products that we sell and the number of farms and sources that they can come from. Now, we're a UK retailer, but essentially we are what we would call ourselves a global business. We source for our products from all over the world, and our finished products come from over 72 countries from around the world. As you can see from that map, some of the countries that we source from directly. Now, in terms of sustainability, we have been working on sustainability for quite a while. We have historically engaged with commodities such as timber and paper back in the early 1990s. But then in 2011, we pulled all our sustainability targets together and updated them and produced what we call our 2020 sustainability plan. Now that was really trying to obviously focus on where we're going towards 2020, and we wanted to make sure that we had a comprehensive sustainability strategy looking at both environmental and social targets. Now, in terms of the key targets for this for CDP and for deforestation, they essentially are. We have committed ourselves to sourcing all of our key raw materials and commodities sustainably to an independent standard. I'll come on to those later, but essentially they cover all the commodities that we're talking about in terms of CDP, whether that's timber, palm oil, soy, cattle products, or biofuels. And we've also committed ourselves by 2020 to ensure that our own brand products do not contribute towards global deforestation. So, why did we do the 2020 plan? I mean, it's very much the reasons that we've heard previously, but it's also there are the multiple reasons. Clearly, reputation is one of those reasons. Anticipation of regulation, but we have also done this because we want to ensure security of supply. Clearly, if we're working with high-risk suppliers or sourcing from high-risk areas, there's always the risk that you will not be able to source in the future for various reasons. So, sourcing sustainably is very much a part of securing our supply for the indefinite future. And finally, it's also very important for our customers. We ask our customers on a regular basis what's important for them, what values do they have, and what do they expect from us. And this is very much a customer expectation that we're doing the right thing. Now, in terms of our 2020 plan, there are 20 targets to be achieved by 2020. 14 of them need to be delivered through our supply chain. And as I mentioned, those two targets to do with sourcing sustainably and no deforestation are the most relevant. And we have 35 key raw materials that we intend to ensure are sustainable. As I mentioned, that is timber, palm oil, biofuels, cattle products, and soy are included in that. So how do we get started? So risk assessment is essential. You need to basically have a baseline assessment of where you are and a scale of the issues that you're facing. And we've done this over a number of years. And actually, when we were putting together our sustainability plan, we did a lot of stakeholder engagement to understand what was important to the wider stakeholders. And then we did a risk assessment ourselves to look at the state of our supply chains. And that really helped understand the scale of the issues and the issues that we needed to get on and tackle. And we've also scoped our products. We've scoped them in terms of the products we sell, in terms of the packaging that we use, in terms of things that we actually don't sell but have in our stores. And as you can see, we use all of the products, the relevant products across our business, whether it's timber in our products, in our packaging, or actually for till receipts, palm oil in both food and non-food products. Soya, whether that's in directly as an ingredient or whether it's actually animal feed, and we clearly use beef and biofuels we sell to our customers. Now, in terms of risk assessment, there are plenty of tools out there, and I just wanted to quickly draw attention to a few that I found particularly helpful. Now, obviously you need to know a bit about your supply chain, but whilst you might not be able to have absolute full traceability, you can work with the information that you have. You should. The first picture to show you is actually a very recent report that came out from the Centre for Global Development, showing the risk of emissions associated with those key commodities and which countries they originate from, so either from Brazil or Indonesia. And you can see that if you're sourcing from these countries, you can assess the potential risk that you may be associated with this deforestation and embedded emissions. And going beyond that, if you actually know the actual area of a country you're sourcing from, then there are plenty of tools on that you can access. One is just actually satellite data that you can find on Google, and if you know your companies, obviously there are clearly tools such as a CDP report where you can see what your companies in your supply chain are doing. So clearly, if you have knowledge of the country you're sourcing from, you can get a good sense of the potential risk. And going further, once you get more and more detail on traceability, you can really hone down to the actual risk that you're facing. But even where you don't know the risk, the total risk, you can get started and you can work accordingly. Now, in terms of Sainsbury's strategy in working through our risk, as I mentioned, we use all of the commodities that are highlighted as a potential risk. And going forward, what we've found very helpful is by setting a very clear public commitment. It's bound us. It's meant that we have to keep working on these issues. But it's actually been very helpful for our suppliers. It's a very clear communication to them of our intent, of where we're heading, what they need to do, what they need to be getting prepared to do. So we have found that actually has been very, very helpful. And just in a practical sense, you can't do absolutely everything at once, so you do need to prioritize. And so focusing on the key absolute risks, using your risk assessment process has been very helpful, and then focusing on your big wins. Clearly, once you've worked out your footprint and where it's coming from, you can work out where to go. I'll give you palm oil as an example. Palm oil, clearly, we know that it's been sourced from, highly likely from Indonesia and Malaysia. We've been able to ascertain our footprint, who our key suppliers are. And then we've worked up conversion plans and milestones based on our volumes. And biscuits actually was one of the biggest our users of palm oil, and so that was one of the first things that we set about trying to convert over to sustainable palm oil. And once you achieve that, it helps. It shows it's deliverable. It helps build momentum, and it just breaks it down into practical bite-sized pieces in terms of implementing your strategy. And then absolutely essential is to continuously collect data and report on your progress. We do that internally. We obviously do it externally through the CDP. We've reported to on our forest impact since 2009, and it's what it does. It's very helpful in just helping you monitor progress you're making, but also it obviously enables a discussion externally to help you work out where best to go next. So in addition to data collection, we do support independent sustainability standards. As you can see, I've highlighted two here, whether that's the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil to help move over to certified palm oil, or whether it's certified timber from FSC sources. We do definitely use these sustainability products. So whilst you might not have complete traceability in your palm oil, you can at the very least have certified palm oil in your supply chain through using standards such as the RSPO. And then finally, also part of our strategy is that where you don't always have that visibility to start off with, you can put in place measures to try and improve that over the coming years. So that's essential for timber. If we have EU timber regulations where you need to have that visibility, so we have put in place systems to be able to achieve that. It's also where you want to go beyond third-party certification, such as even palm oil itself. Having building upon your traceability is important. So that is also part of our strategy. So where have we got to so far? In terms of we have made progress across the board. In terms of where we've made our most progress, we've currently 93% of the wood used in our own brand products is either recycled or certified FSC or PFC. So we've worked on that for a number of years, and we've managed to get to quite a high percentage coverage. And obviously, we believe that has helped minimise any exposure to risk. By the end of this year, the vast majority of our palm oil and palm derivatives in our own brand products will be certified as sustainable, either as mass balanced or segregated. We have mapped and we continue to map the soya supply chains for both our food ingredients but also for animal feed that goes into our products. Most of our beef is actually sourced in the EU, but the small amount that is sourced from outside the EU, we have it from a very much a approved traceable supply chain, so that we know that there's very low risk of deforestation in that supply chain. And our biofuels, they need to meet EU requirements. They all come from certified sources, and actually the vast majority of our biodiesel comes from waste material. So that is the achievements that we have made to date. Now, in terms of the challenges that we face, and you probably may have faced it yourselves, is that you don't always have your full traceability. You certainly don't have it when you start on a journey, and it's always a continuous challenge that you need to keep improving. So I've highlighted what a simplistic palm oil supply chain looks like, and just getting back to the plantations and working which ones you're sourcing from is a big challenge, and you need to work with the supply chain to achieve that, and that's something that we still need to work on. There isn't always availability of certified material. Again, the palm oil example is we have managed to convert a big part of our volume, but there are some very small derivatives that we have not yet been able to source, and that's because the supply chain hasn't yet got itself in a position to provide that to us. So that is one challenge that we continue to work on. And of course, using sustainability standards is very helpful, but sometimes they don't go as far as you want in terms of sustainability, the RSPO being one, in terms of not entirely guaranteeing zero deforestation. So our focus going forward, the four things: we are going to continue our focus in terms of sourcing our raw materials to holistic sustainability criteria. We have going to focus more on sustainable soya. That is certainly an area for us to improve upon. We want to absolutely embed no deforestation within the work that we've already done. As I say, I've given the example of palm oil, build on RSPO to go further in terms of ensuring no deforestation. And we want to generally improve the traceability of all our raw materials, because obviously once you have that much greater traceability, you're absolutely better able to understand the risks that you face. So that was very much a quick run-through in terms of our approach to actually trying to deliver no deforestation in our supply chains, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Russell. Yes, as Russell said, we've now got time to answer, the presenters have time to answer a few questions. Just to remind you, there's a box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen where you can submit your questions. But to kick off, I've got one here for Paul. So there's one here that asks, how does the CDP identify sector leaders, and which sectors do you see performing the best and worst?
Great, thanks, Victoria. And I just want to also thank Pete and Russell it's great to hear Pete say that responsible index investors need to tackle deforestation and need data to do that, and for Russell to talk through the ambition and the journey that Sainsbury's is on. So really great to hear those. In terms of how do we identify sector leaders, obviously we ask a set of questions that's publicly available on our website. We get the responses from the companies, and then we have a scoring, ranking methodology that we analyse those responses against. And at a very sort of high level, what that really is looking at is, under each of these 5 elements of action, from commitments, risk assessment, targets, implementation, and leadership, which actions and activities is the company taking against those criteria. That then produces a score basically for all companies, and then those who score top on a sector are the sector leaders. So I was going to say it's very straightforward. Identifying really who the sector leaders is quite a lot of work, but the methodology is well developed and quite straightforward. So in terms of who really are the leaders, what we really see here is, and what CDP is trying to do, is to create a race to the top, and that's why we very much talk about who the leaders are. And I identified in the report a number of the leaders by company, but at a sector level, we very much see that the materials, packaged foods, industrial and auto sectors are responding well, and materials, particularly with timber, is really, as a sector overall, leading. At this stage, because everything's developing so fast, we tend not to sort of focus too much on who's not doing enough. The companies who are not doing enough are those companies who are not yet able to openly disclose on this issue. And you'll see in the back of the report, page 32 to 34, a whole list of those. I'm not going to read those out, but you can all see them. And if you're an investor in those companies, you should be asking them why they're not able to disclose. Are they not managing this properly? Is there hidden risk? And there's a couple of sectors that don't disclose as well as others, but I'll leave you to look at that list.
Great, thank you very much. So a question for Russell. As a global business, do you find your suppliers in different regions have different levels of awareness about sustainable commodities?
I would say that yes, you do face that, but I think in terms of, I think it goes back to an earlier slide. I think that Paul showed if you're talking to a supplier who's very much directly engaged with production, they tend to have a much better understanding of the risks that they face. If you're talking to a supplier who's kind of midway through the supply chain, so less directly in contact with the impacts on the ground, they may not have as much understanding on the issue. And again, I think it does vary from commodity to commodity. As I say, historically, people have worked on timber a lot. Palm oil is very much on the agenda with lots of suppliers. It might not be the case for other commodities.
Thank you very much. And a question for Pierre. What level of corporate awareness do you find when engaging companies on deforestation and palm oil?
And even within sectors. I think the consumer-facing companies, brands in particular, are most sensitive to this. Reputational risk is going to hit them first, before it hits anyone else, and also before it may hit them materially. I mean, in direct effects, perhaps. If your supply chain breaks down, obviously that's a direct effect. But before that, you're probably going to see reputational risks. So it varies, and even though reputational risk is an important part of the risk that we feel companies run in not taking deforestation seriously, we try to appeal to other arguments too, right? We believe that security of supply, sustainability of supply, reliability of supply is a very more, and is arguably a more important driver, at least in the long run. On the producer side, we believe that it's indeed, it is a license to operate, or perhaps a license to grow thing, more perhaps than a reputational thing. Not perhaps immediately, but in the long run, that's arguably more important to us.
Thank you. So another one for Paul. So WWF International follows with interest the work of CDP. They share the view on the importance of transparency and motivating continual improvement on deforestation risk issues, one of their specialities. Do you see opportunities for synergies with NGOs?
Thanks, Victoria and Helma. Yes, certainly we do. I mean, we know, of course, tackling an issue like deforestation involves significant collaboration, and that's collaboration with investors, companies with their suppliers we've been talking about, but also collaboration across the NGOs working on this issue. I know that my colleagues in our forest team are in touch with colleagues at WWF on this issue, and really we seek to work with the leading NGOs who are tackling deforestation, because ultimately we need to make sure that our messages are aligned and consistent and really pushing together. We have done a considerable amount of work with the Tropical Forest Alliance, and we're a partner of that. and really very much at CDP we're open to working with other NGOs on this issue.
Great answer, thank you. And along a similar vein, for Russell, do you collaborate or learn from any of your peer companies on these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, you always want to see, are you doing it the right way? Has anyone found a better way to kind of address these issues? So, yes, I mean, always open to hearing from other companies in terms of how they have improved their traceability system, how they've gone about actually improving the risk on the ground. So yes, we do look to kind of learn from others in that regard.
Great. And Pete, what piece of advice would you give to a company right at the beginning of this journey?
What I think is probably the best way to start is again to approach this from a risk angle. Just also to perhaps broaden the support to looking at what for a lot of people are still issues that can wait. Right? We would rather ignore them. These are externalities for a reason. You can ignore them for a while. So if you bring it back to why is this important to us in as concrete terms as possible, I think that helps a lot. And in a way, I feel that sometimes the NGO community is shooting itself in the foot, because if you expect perhaps too much by way of disclosure from companies, if you throw at them, the whole 587 indicators at them, you kind of miss the point. You may create perhaps more confusion than you get back in meaningful disclosure. So we rather see it tightly managed, perhaps by a risk or a strategic department, rather than public relations. And I think that is an important start. Don't do it for show. Do it for a good, almost selfish reason.
Great, thanks. And Paul, why do you focus on the role of businesses rather than governments in tackling deforestation?
I mean, certainly governments have a very important role to play in tackling deforestation, both in terms of setting regulation or standards on the import of these commodities and their sustainability, as well, of course, governments themselves are big procurers of many goods and services that may contain commodities from deforestation sources. So governments have to act on this issue. The work of CDP is very much focused at the nexus of the investment community and the business community. And ultimately, we would say that investors, business, and governments have to work together. But clearly, I think you can see that actually many companies are ahead on this issue than governments. And the critical thing, and this was talked about earlier, Russell mentioned it, is that big business and us as individual consumers, we're creating the demand for the products and services that may cause deforestation, and it's tackling that channel of demand which businesses have a huge role to play in, that says we want to demand only sustainable source commodities. That really will change the game on deforestation, because it's easy to look at countries like Brazil or Indonesia and blame the governments there and say, well, the governments of these countries should do more. The governments of both those countries are doing a lot to tackle this issue, but if we don't tackle that source of demand, then it will make their job very, very difficult. So that's why we really tackle the role of business, because if we can change the demand patterns towards sustainable source commodities, that will enable everybody else to really move forward on this issue.
Right, thank you. And Russell, from your point of view, how do you communicate to your consumers about the work you're doing on deforestation?
Well, we do it in a number of ways. I think we have the kind of the conventional CSR reports that we do every year, and so obviously that's you can access on the internet on our website. We will have We have certain messages that we have inside our stores, so you can see the progress that we've made and things that we've been able to achieve. We also do use on-pack labeling for some of these commodities. So if we have certified materials such as FSC, you'll see the FSC logo on there. We also like to communicate on pack where we're using sustainable palm oil as well. So we do have multiple avenues in which we like to communicate what we're doing on sustainability to our customers.
Great. And Pete, do you see investor engagement going beyond the current focus on palm oil?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I haven't mentioned this yet, but investors are actually quite well organized around palm oil. There's this working group under the Principles for Responsible Investment, the PRI, in which we collaborate, engaging with palm oil buyers and indeed producers. I think that is a model that is perhaps worth replicating around other commodities. And I think many investors would look at palm oil as perhaps a template on which to build similar investor coalitions for other commodities. There's the round tables already. I think they all differ in the amount of investor interest they've been able to attract. But we do see that around soy, for example, or even sugar, cocoa, cotton, you could indeed replicate what we've been doing around palm oil. Pulp and paper, obviously, is when it comes to deforestation, that's probably the biggest.
Thank you. And back to Paul, why does the CDP not publicise forest scores?
Thanks, Victoria. Well, as we talked about earlier, we are publicising the leaders, the companies who are doing the best. The reason we don't, at this point in time, publish all of the scores from the companies, there's a couple of those. Firstly, that this issue is rapidly evolving and how companies are engaging with it. Equally, our own ranking on forest is what we see as very much, it's a work in progress. We don't think it's perfect, so we don't want to call out companies and saying that they may not be scoring particularly well until we've really evolved that methodology. Our focus at the moment is calling out the companies who are not disclosing. I mentioned those earlier, they're listed in the back of the report. We want to get more companies disclosing before we start publishing rankings. What we do with the rankings, though, is we do share those with the responding companies, because the purpose of those rankings is really a relative assessment. No company's perfect, but to say, look, where is the company doing well? Where can it improve? And to use that as a tool to stimulate continuous improvement in this area. We also share those rankings with investors, such as Pete and others who are interested in that. I think in time, as we do on climate change, we are likely to start publishing the full set of scores, but we want to get more companies involved and ensure that our ranking is sophisticated enough before we do that.
Sure, great answer. And Russell, what have you found most beneficial about responding to CDP's forest program?
In a way, the most obvious, obviously, it's great to be recognised if you're doing some work and to be recognised for that. But actually, it's kind of embedding that reporting as kind of across the business, and obviously every year we need to pull lots of data together. We do that for various other reports anyway, but it's pulling that data together, and it's a timely reminder every year of what progress you've made, where you're getting to, and it just helps you monitor where you are and where you still need to improve your performance. So in a way, actually, I would say it's a great management tool.
Great, thank you. For Pete, what role do you see CDP's forest program playing on this issue?
I would argue the same as what Russell just did. To us, it's a very useful thing that we believe gains value to the type of investor that we are by broadening the set of companies and sectors that disclose. Maybe companies more than sectors, companies in particular. So more of the same, really, is what we would say.
Okay, thank you. Paul, why do you think producers and processors are performing better?
Thanks, Victoria. I think in part it's because the producers and processors have seen quite significant pressure down their supply chains. So they're getting real requests for information that we're talking about here today, and pressure from some of their suppliers, not all. They're also obviously close to the ground. The producers are the ones who are responsible for the land that may or may not be deforested. So, you could say they're on the front line, but what we do need to see is not just the producers and processors, although they're critically important. They're the people who really can provide the sustainable commodities, but really for all of them to work through the whole value chain. So, as we said before, up to the retailers and the manufacturers, and there's more to do there. The other thing to say is that producers, there are some very large producers, and they tend to be quite good at responding. And we talked about Wilmar International earlier. Some of the big producers made huge steps and commitments on sustainability. There are, of course, thousands of small producers on the ground in Brazil and Indonesia. It can be harder for those small producers to really take leadership in this area, and that's why they need a lot of help from the companies they're providing these commodities to.
Thank you very much. So Russell, are you confident that Sainsbury's will eliminate deforestation from its supply chains?
I would say it's very much, we're seeing improvements. I think it's a challenge to really, we could completely rely on certification, but if certification isn't going to be, if sometimes it's not always the strongest approach, you do need to have that go beyond and do that traceability, and that is quite a lot of work, especially when you're the retailer who can be 6 or 7 steps removed from the actual producer themselves. So I am confident that we will find ways to keep improving our progress. I think there are certainly still challenges that we need to overcome, but actually I think we have made a lot of progress, and I think we can still continue to do so.
Thank you. And Pete, what key indicators do you look for when assessing a company's approach to deforestation of palm oil?
Yeah, what we'd like to see, I think, in particular is ultimately the main thing we're after is how much of your company, how much of your supplies, perhaps, depending on the sector you're in, is at risk from governments clamping down on deforestation, for example. How much of your added value is at stake? How much of the supply chain is at risk? Even though the main idea is pretty clear to us, what I think is still kind of missing from what we see by way of indicators is what I always call Bloomberg readiness. It would be great to have this stuff fit for the Bloomberg terminal. And that means that you have to boil down some of these indicators to what the real essence here is. And before I drew this parallel with the fossil fuel sector, I think, at least from the production side, that is quite important. That is the sort of distinction that we'd like to see from trusted, traceable, sustainable production and the less so, therefore the more risky production of commodities. Back to value at risk really is what I would say to this.
Thanks very much, Pete. And I think that's just about all we've got time for today, but thank you for a great extended Q&A session. I'd like to thank all the presenters and everyone who's joined us listening to the webinar. The recording will be archived on the TW's platform, and I'll send you all a link via email when it's live. For any questions we didn't get time to answer, you can post your discussions on the TW's platform. I hope you found it informative and enjoyable. And if you're interested in sustainable timber in the supply chain, we have a webinar on just that on Thursday, the 27th of November. More details of this can be found on the TW's platform. So thank you very much, and I hope to speak to you all again soon.
All right, very good. Bye then.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.